Um, I think it would be, it's worth talking about all the different ways that the Metropolitan Council as a jurisdiction or as a governmental entity might touch on Upper Harbor Terminal. But as far as I know to date, I don't think we've had all that much involvement, certainly not in the concept, unless you know something I don't know, Cameron. Um, but I do know that like as the project moves forward, we would have some role to play, and I can kind of start to describe what that is. Our role, we run systems, so we have systems that we own, operate, and plan for. Not always all together in that order. So, like the regional park system, we don't own the parks, but we help plan the parks. We set the policy for the regional park system. The transit system, you're all well aware, Metro Transit. We do run the transit system, and the wastewater system. The wastewater from this location heads over to our treatment plant over in St. Paul. So the wastewater side of things, we would be obviously looking at for any new development. Am I missing a system? I don't think so. We do have affordable housing policy at the regional level. Certainly, we have an authority to review all of the comprehensive plans. So the Minneapolis Comprehensive Plan, we would have reviewed that against our systems to make sure that the plan conformed to our systems. But we kind of sit at this level, the city's at this level. So a lot of what we do is more regional in scale. So the 7-county metropolitan area, consisting of half the state's population, that is the metropolitan area that the Metropolitan Council has a degree of jurisdiction over. Although nearly all of the work we do is in collaboration or partnership with local communities and other stakeholders. That kind of describes the Metropolitan Council a little bit. We were created in 1967, and we were changed a little bit in the 70s and again in the 90s. And the main reason we were created is after World War II, when there's a lot of suburban development, we had a lot of problems with pollution. The river was the river was awful. So the idea around the late 60s, in line with what was happening at the federal level with the National Environmental Policy Act, we were also doing similar things here in Minnesota. So the Metropolitan Council was really created initially as a response to the pollution issue around wastewater or effluent that was running into our rivers, streams, and lakes. At that time, we had a lot of private wastewater into White Bear Lake. You can imagine kind of it's not even flowing away. So.
We need people to mute their phones or computers on the dialogue. Thank you.
So we're kind of an interesting organization, and we help with some of the highway planning as well. So we're passed through for federal money for highways. And there's a regional solicitation process that the region goes to highway projects, and that comes through the Metropolitan Council as well. We also, one area that the Upper Harbor Terminal could benefit from in terms of the Met Council, we have a pot of money that we can access to clean up sites. So we call it our tax-based revitalization program. It's part of the Livable Communities account, which is a competitive process, but that particular pot of money is for cleanup to make sites, essentially remediate sites that are contaminated. And it can ease the burden on a city if they want to do that sort of work, because it can be quite expensive. The other pots of money within that same program, the Livable Communities program, are things around, we have money available for affordable housing, have some money available for just really good placemaking. So if Upper Harbor Terminal was going to create a really good bike, ped, like connected environment with like really good amenities, nice open spaces for the residents to gather, then that would be obviously a good thing. The developer in the city could apply for money through that too. Again, it's a competitive process, but I think this site would probably be a very good candidate for this, especially when you think of all the co-benefits. That kind of sums up the Met Council's role. I can touch on some other things. Some of the resources I've provided here, we've done some work. We've done work on the region scale, but you can see from the maps as you page through them that we've looked at climate hazards and how they might affect different cities. So the two climate hazards we looked at with our climate vulnerability assessment are localized flooding, or often called urban flooding. We really understand river flooding. The Army Corps of Engineers and cities have a good handle on river flooding, and we kind of know it's well mapped, although it's changing with climate change, but it's for the most part understood. This kind of flooding that we've been seeing every year, and I think anybody who tries to navigate the city of Minneapolis knows that this is happening. This issue around localized flooding that can affect public safety, can affect transportation across the city. So we've created a map, and this is something that, I printed out the site with this localized flooding on it. And you can kind of see, obviously through redevelopment, a lot of that would probably change, it would be regraded. So, it's showing it as it is now. We had to do a very rough cut. Anybody who's involved in watershed districts who does modeling knows that our flood screening tool is only that. It's a screening tool. It's not perfect because it's just looking at topography.
What are I can see the north-south streets, but what are those two major east-west streets on the example?
Two major east-west streets. Oh, on this one?
Yeah. What's that?
This is downtown. I don't know. I'd have to look that up. We were just providing that as an example, but
yeah, but that's cool.
One thing we were looking at is, we wanted to provide some tools for our own systems. So, for instance, with our buses, if we know where areas might be likely to flood, we can look at how we might reroute the buses, how we might alert riders, so that people know that when an event is occurring. We've also used the localized flooding to look at things like water getting into our wastewater treatment system, which is not a good thing. We don't want gray water into our wastewater treatment system because our region actually has a separated stormwater and sewer, which is really good. Some cities do not have that. And that's why in places like Boston, when you get heavy rains, you get a lot of sewer into your basement. You don't want that. So we're actually fortunate that people were forward thinking and planned for that long ago. But still, we want to know where the water might flow so that we know how to plan for our infrastructure.
So are we discussing as far as flooding, what the flooding that took place in North Minneapolis last spring?
Yeah.
Because most of North Minneapolis was flooded last spring.
Well, and I think that would be...
The news only showed by 94.
Okay.
No, it went into North Minneapolis, all the way to Fremont, from Lowry to Plymouth. All of those streets and the side streets in between, from 94 back, all of the areas was flooded. And from what I saw on somebody else's page, there was flooding in Fallwood as well. It didn't flood by my house, but just know that the news only showed by 94 on Broadway.
Yeah.
But it flooded all the way back.
Well, and it'll be interesting that's why for you folks to look at the map and play around with the map, it'd be interesting to see if that actually is consistent with what the city's experiencing in that area. The reason we made the map public is because we want cities to be more proactive about this issue. Some people could say that, it could cause alarm, but we'd rather have the public be aware of areas that might flood, that are prone to flooding, and then cities deal with that issue.
Well, it did cause alarm because I had never seen that happen before. And I was actually outside when it happened. I was driving. And when it happened, I'm like, oh my God, what is going on? And I was on Fremont, actually. And that's how I know, because I'm like, okay, how can we get out of this water? But there was nowhere to go. There was water everywhere. And it was up to like the middle of the car tires, all the way to Plymouth. And then a lot of people posted it on Facebook where in other areas where it happened. But then later on, when I got home, I started looking at people have went in,
Mhm.
they would have saw more. Because it was up to the middle of the rim, and I drove a truck at that time. So it was in the middle of the tire of my car. So it was up past the curtains. Just know that.
I think that's alarm. That's concerning to me because one thing that we're finding is that with these rain events, it can happen very fast
Because of the rain burst.
in a very small area. And before you know it, and it may not even affect the area around there. There was an incident not even that long ago. It barely made the news, but we caught it on Twitter and we checked it against our map and it checked out where a family had to be rescued in an underpass. I mean, it was up like coming into the actual vehicle, but it didn't even make the news. And it's like, that's pretty newsworthy. And I think the problem is sometimes, a lot of times cities can't afford to, necessarily mitigate for that flooding right away. It's very expensive. So in that case, they just put up a sign for the time being. But I think some cities are well aware of this problem. But we're trying to get more folk to talk about it, to be more aware of this issue, because it's not going to go away. It's only going to get worse. And the other piece in this assessment is the urban heat island effect. So we have a heat map. Again, that's available to the public. And what I did here is I printed out the heat map, and then I printed out a map showing the tree canopy. So for you tree folk, you'd be interested. We do have a map, a full regional picture of the tree canopy. And then if you flip on the very last one, is it combined? So to kind of show how the trees really have a cooling effect. I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer, right? But again, we're trying to really raise the issue of, if we're going to deal with this urban heat island effect, we need a lot more green infrastructure. We need to start planning around this. I've worked for a lot of cities in the past, and one thing that was always hard is that a lot of the industrial and commercial land uses have very little in the way of landscaping requirements. And what I'm really trying to push here is for more cities to essentially use the same residential standard for trees in those commercial and industrial areas. But you'll see the map there. This is land surface temperature, and it's a snapshot in time. So that was during a heat wave in 2016. And that's surface temperature, it's not air temperature. So that's what you would experience on the ground. I always talk about it in terms of my dog, like when he does that little dance when it's too hot, like what he would feel on his paws. So that's like 125 degrees on the ground, just in
the red area?
Just in that upper harbor terminal area, in the red area. Yeah.
Well, the unfortunate reality is that most people haven't made the relationship to lack of tree canopy to the index in the city, because we haven't been valued as part of the whole environmental disparities. Is it more affluent community, richer community, have that, and unfortunately, the redlining that has happened historically, that's where the resources apply to restore the tree. And that's where the asthma grows. So there's a direct correlation between our health and well-being can be drawn to how much green space we have, what kind of green canopy we have. And if you talk about healthy green communities or livable communities, then that has to be something that we have to take into consideration as we move forward, or otherwise all of these plans that everybody's talking about in terms of carbon mitigation isn't going to be able to be reality. We are the ones that are going to be responsible for making that a reality, or to continue down the wrong road the wrong way.
It's very easy to see that you can correlate the red areas to the area.
Yeah, and I didn't include land use there, but it's interesting to see the correlation. One of the images I like to show a lot is most of the residential areas, because they have a lot of trees, they tend to be a little bit cooler. But I came across this just doing the research and looking, and if you look at the map yourself, if you zoom in, it's really interesting. You can actually see the path of the 2011 North Minneapolis tornado, because you can see the heat effect that the taking out those trees has had. So I've used that a lot to say, look at, this is a scar across the landscape where the trees were taken out, and look how much hotter that neighborhood is because of that. And it's going to take, 15, 20 years to get that back, that cooling back in that neighborhood.
So I feel a little different. I mean, and I understand the heat and the trees and the relationship. I get that. But the issue that I have is because the tree canopies are beautiful. When I ride down Emerson and I see how beautiful the trees are, but they have pretty lights to go along with it. So my thing about that is that God came in 2011 and cleaned up the north side. He knocked down some of those trees because we couldn't see from one block to the next. So I'm looking at a safety perspective. I understand that it's for us to have help with climate change and for it to be pretty in the cool ground. I get that. But when we have all those trees, just one thing I know for sure is that North Minneapolis does not have a shortage of trees. It says it does, but from where I sit, it doesn't, because I'm talking about from a safety issue. So when you talk about the trees, what about the lighting and the visibility as for citizens to walk down the street or be comfortable in their neighborhood because of all the trees, because you can't see from where you're going. You can't see down the block. So now, you can't see down the block. I can stand in front of my house and see 4 blocks down, whereas before I couldn't. So it's opened up the area for people to feel safer than being outside. That's my concern. I also understand that the rainforest is the lungs of the earth, which provides us with oxygen. And because we've done such a horrible job as human beings taking care of this wonderful earth that we live on, now we have to figure out something to fix it. Okay, well, if we plant more trees, like I said, God came and cleaned up the north side and made us what we need. And a few more people that I talked to didn't want to say about taking out some of the trees. Now we're planting them back. It is beautiful and it helps with climate change. But what we're going to do about lighting and for people in their communities to feel safe going out to their car because some food is hiding behind a tree that we planted.
Hello?
Yeah.
So then, wait, one more thing. So then, as May Council, because you said you all have funds, so then is there going to be some type of funds that's going to be put in more lighting, or is it going to be a cost to the block where our taxes get raised to pay for more lighting? Because we have to feel safe where we live. Because I like I said, I understand as far as the trees, because I have Ezekiel. He's in front of my house. I love him. He does everything that he is supposed to do. When a tornado came, he's so big. He'll take out half the block. And he'll take out half the block. And when the tornado came, he didn't budge. Not even a little bit. A couple of branches fell off, that was it. And he does what he's supposed to do, cool, and everything, and gives us wonderful shade, and helps our life, and all of that. But then I think about the roots too, and how the roots to trees affects the plumbing. And then the city decides to plant these trees, but when it comes and it affects our pipes, then we, the residents again, gotta pay for it. Homeowners gotta pay for it. So then there's another tax. So I don't have anything against trees. I get it. But who's gonna help us pay for this stuff? And is the taxes gonna continue to go up as we're still being redlined and pushed out? Is this for residents that live here, especially in North Minneapolis, us being, 50% color, black people live here, and the Southeast Asians who are already can't afford it? You have to think about cost as well, and safety, as well as what you're saying. Just something to think about.
Mm-hmm.
Hello?
Because apparently you can tell I put a lot of thought.
Thank you.
Hello?
Is someone trying
Hello?
to say something on the call?
Yes, hi, this is LaShella Sims of Micah.
There's a radio or something.
Can you hear me?
We can barely hear you.
Yeah, we need to
How
have
about
those
this?
those phones muted online because it interferes. Okay. Please text the questions to 612 3478.
So one thing I noticed is on this map is that the east side of the river's got a lot of green on it on this map of that land surface temperature. As you can see, that there's a lot of green on the east side of the river, but not much on the west side. And so as you know, as we think about what can happen on the Upper Harbor Terminal property, greening it would help along the river. Does the Met Council deal with stormwater?
No. We do have a water resources group. We've always been tasked with checking water quality, but it's always been more related to the wastewater treatment plants. So there is a group that tests the water, obviously, to make sure that the water coming out of our plants is cleaner than what was coming in. Or, well, no, it has to be cleaner than what was coming in. But the water coming out of the waste treatment plant has to be cleaner than the river. You know, we make sure of that. So we do have, but we don't deal with stormwater. That would be the watershed. That would be Mississippi.
Watershed management.
Yeah. And I was suggesting they might be a good group to have come here at some point. Yeah. Oh, they've been okay.
I mean, they haven't spoken, but they've been.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
We've invited for the.
Get on there.
So,
Oh, yes.
is this area here where the railroad is, or why is it that there aren't any there? And is it possible then that people would be putting money towards this, kind of going back to what Metropolitan was talking about? The planting of trees, so.
I think that is the railroad. Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, because we didn't have a projector, we could have done a lot more flying around and looking at things. But yeah, that is the railroad, which is why it's not green. We don't have funds to help with planting trees. It's not something that we're authorized to do, really. When we do work like around our light rail, we did a lot of work in partnership with, it would tend to be the watershed districts or the city, Public Works, that does most of that work. We are looking at trying to provide more resources around the country. All the different cities work together towards a common goal of number one, making sure we're dealing with emerald ash borer, because right now we're going to lose about 3 million of the metropolitan trees just because of this invasive species. So the problem is a lot of cities they're doing their own thing. They're not necessarily talking to each other. So that's where the Metropolitan Council can serve a role, trying to get everyone together to work on this and share resources. So the urban tree canopy issue is kind of an interesting one, because the city of Minneapolis has a forestry department, but some cities, they might borrow a forester from another city. They might just have a part-time person. So getting a sense of what resources are out there and who's doing what, I think that's a role we can fill, but we don't really have any funds to help with that. I don't know if that would ever change. I think the legislature would probably have to give us that authority. I don't see that happening. But yeah.
Oh, the park board does forestry.
Oh yeah. Yep.
So when the city gets its proposal ready to go and the Park and Rec Board gets its proposal ready to go, will the Met Council weigh in then? Will they review these proposals, and in what way would that happen?
The only way we would review the proposals is we would tend to review the proposals if the city was changing its comprehensive plan to to incorporate the proposals. So if there was a land use change because of the development at Upper Harbor Terminal, then it would come through us. But again, we would tend to only look at the impacts on the systems. We don't tend to weigh in at the local level because that's more of a local decision. That would be a city decision in terms of the zoning. We don't get involved in zoning or anything like that. We don't get involved in building design or building heights or anything like that. But if they were proposing something that might have an impact on our wastewater system, we might comment on that or have issue with that, or we would maybe comment on transit, making sure that there's provision for transit stops at the development, making sure that people can get to transit.
Well, because that's what amazes me, that there's been no interaction with you guys, at this stage of the game. If we're talking about building an amphitheater to bring 50,000 people, one way in, it's an island basically, and we're talking about a critical, that we're putting a lot of public dollars in, $20 million is the figure I think that they're going to go ask for. So it's not just a local issue. I mean, it's a critical factor for there not to be an environmental impact plan, for there not to be a transportation plan. To me, really seems to be, I'm dumbfounded by that there's no kind of coordination, this level of investment, this level of infrastructure transformation, that you haven't been at the table. It's almost as absurd that the National Park Service hasn't been at the table with this development. This is not an isolated event that, some private developer is building a single building. Mm-hmm. This is a development, I refer to it as our Panama Canal, because it's going to change the whole course of history, economics, housing, displacement, all of those critical factors that we all attribute to equity. Mm-hmm. And health and well-being and a livable, healthy community. None of this has been coordinated. None of this has brought on the expertise. And so we're buying basically a pig in a poke, because there's been no initial involvement from a regional perspective with all of this stuff, even the Mississippi River. I mean, it might be one thing if it was, a little small lake in the backyard, but this is the Mississippi that they're sitting on. And for the Met Council not to be intricately involved in the discourse, to me is astounding. That this big a level of development, with this amount of public dollars, that we're not having more what do you call it? What's the whole issue on the federal level of offsite or not also some check and balance by some other players, rather than it being driven solely by some commercial developers. There needs to be more oversight. Oversight's the word.
So do you want to respond? And then Michelle, because I think what Mike was asking, what is standard process and protocol, and were they errant on that?
It's a good question. Do you want to weigh in on that, or do you want me to go for that?
I think about it in terms of working with Jim a lot. He's one of our senior environmental reviewers, Jim Larson, and training in with him. He's been doing this for 25 years, and a lot of the time it's coming in. By the time it gets to us, it's already gone through pre-development, or if we're reviewing an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement or worksheet, they're already applying for permits with the city. They've already checked in with the county. They've already tried to get their ducks in a row with the state. And I mean, honestly, that's his biggest critique a lot of the time, is that when we are brought in terms of our process as it is right now, where we're required to come in, is kind of too late to bar or heavily influence anything beyond, are they in line with the policies that we already have in place? However, with other projects, when folk are proactive, a city may reach out to us, a township, a community organization, advocacy groups, etc. There's a lot of precedent for folk reaching out to us earlier, where we may be able to do something with this massive site in 5-10 years from right now, in 2 years. I wonder if you could help us out in terms of how to think about that, what resources are available to us. So a lot of the time it's driven by to the developer, you know, and the city at hand, the actors involved around it.
So there is no bus line. That was the thing that and so when there was that survey going around, I had written concern. And the woman who was in charge of that said that wasn't you. And CC my comment. Of course, Eric has got back. So it's like this whole, it's not ours, it's not ours. And I think what we're saying here is that we want it and need it to be yours and need this oversight from you. The city is not going to do it. And need you guys to run with it, right? Because there has to be transportation. It doesn't make sense not allow people to get to this site. You can't walk there. There isn't a neighborhood site. So, you know, we're asking you.
Is there anything about their old project? What's that about?
Well, we can, I think, I mean, to Michael's point, and I think I was describing our process, typically how it works, and you're right, normally we're reviewing small land use changes, and a lot of times it's just an administrative process. It doesn't even go through our full council. But the amphitheater piece and a number of people that are going to be coming and going from this site, it really warrants and almost requires transit. Because I know that with the Allianz Stadium, there was a lot of, I wouldn't say that's a good example. Again, it's that thing of sometimes we're at the table quite late and then it's trying to work it out. I wouldn't say the solution in that case in St. Paul has been fantastic, but you know, we're trying to make it work. I think this warrants, I think we should be at the table with them. We should be there early, especially when it comes to the transit conversation, and making sure that there's also other major infrastructure pieces too. With that many people coming and going from the site, wastewater is going to have an interest in this. I don't know much about the history or where the city's at with the process, or who they've involved, or what kind of framework they're using. I mean, we haven't really. I'm not as versed in the project to know much about that, and maybe you all can.
I've just heard a lot of criticism.
Tell us about it, but.
So just like Elder Chambers just stated, it's like it's over there, it's like pretty much one way in, one way out. Michelle just said, what about transportation? So here's my thought about it. They didn't think about people that might want to catch the bus there, or could they try to take transportation there? That's why I was omitted. But what about all the cars? What about all the cars that's going to come back and forth through there, and the emissions and all the pollution that's going on, and all the cars are not e-cars. So all of the cars that the exhaust and things that's filtered through the air that's going to come at each event is going to affect the north side because it's going to be in the air. So for you all not to be in the process with that, we're in a one way in and one way out, pretty much. Like you said, a Panama Canal, no transportation as far as bus services, bicycle lanes. A lot of people may not even catch the bus, but still, with all that traffic that's going to be coming back and forth there, what does that look like? How is that going to affect the people that live here? Has anybody thought about that? And how this is going to affect the people that live in North Minneapolis and even Northeast, because it's still in the air, it goes across the water.
Mm-hmm.
Wind is wind.
Mm-hmm.
Most people, it's not just even driving in there. It's the parking in front of that elderly lady's home.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden now there's not going to be any parking because 50,000 young teenagers have come to see, whoever, Beyonce or whatever.
Yeah.
And so they're going to, and what does that mean in terms of, you talk about the trees and climate safety? In a neighborhood that already has health economic disparities,
Right.
what do you think rich suburbanites coming in, because we better call a spade a spade. This is nothing more than a mini-me of the Viking Stadium and of the Twin Stadium. It's another pleasure palace for the rich suburbanites who have the kind of disposable income that they will come and take advantage of these amenities. Our community won't be utilizing, but our young, unfortunately unemployed, some folks are using drugs. You think they might be doing some planning? You know, are we gonna see a spike in crime? Are we gonna see a spike in police brutality? Are we gonna see a spike in terms of homicides in our community that will once again go to blemish North Minneapolis?
Oh, but here's the thing, though, but here's the thing. Because our area, our neighborhood is being gentrified, this is another way to push us out. So then where are we supposed to go? Those that call North Minneapolis homeless, that live here and can afford to live here. Because this 48-acre monstrosity is getting ready to be put in our neighborhood, what about us? Has anybody thought about how this is gonna affect? Again, I just stated a little bit ago, how Philippe is the only councilman that's being talked to at these meetings, and he's on the committee. Where's Jeremiah? Where's the council person for cabinet? Where's all these, for these neighborhoods that is gonna be affected, because it's going to affect us, and we already have the highest disparities when it comes to health as far as the asthma and all different types of things for the people that already live here.
So
How's that gonna affect us?
let's take advantage to this group that's here, this agency, what your jurisdictions are, what your goals and objectives are to community. So where does this development fall in, you know, the size of it? And given that size, when do they come to Met Council for planning? You know, because I opened a business down the way and I couldn't get very far until I paid my SAC fees.
Mm-hmm.
So where is that the equivalent? Let's take small business and how I was held to a certain flush standard. Where are they? Because they're moving forward with state bond with a plan that hasn't been vetted. So really tell us what you can about what kind of jurisdiction and process that you can lend to people who are asking hard questions.
And then the other part is that you can take what we're saying to you and take it back, because they'll listen to you. You're the Met Council. This is what the community said to us that was at the meeting, because we're the Met Council. It's like, did you see the Avengers? Did you see the Avengers when Loki was talking to the Hulk?
Okay.
And did you see that? And Loki said, "I am a god." And Hulk was
Oh no, I
like,
had to see it. Yeah.
That's the Met Council in the city.
Yeah, go down there and beat them up.
Here's a question here.
Well, let's see if they have a response to the question. They haven't been on mic for a while, so send that in.
You want to attempt that one? Or?
I mean, I have a. Is this my council cap or private citizen cap?
I think I used my private citizen cap earlier.
Okay.
But maybe you can wear yours.
Yeah, in the official capacity, it's yes. They're going to need sewer if it's going to be developed. And so for sewer, they're going to say like, all right, how many millions of gallons a day of waste are y'all projected to generate? And then we'll look at the comprehensive plan. And if the city is planned for the area, and it's in the line, it's going to say, okay, we take a pass charge, and you pass it on to people who pay that cost. Like,
Where's the climate consideration?
so that's from the wastewater perspective, and they don't have a mandate to consider that, right? And state statute policy, we don't have a mandate to consider that. Big thing we try to do to get to more of those advocacy things, I think, because there is deep frustration with a certain demographic and specific people within the council, is, all right, if we don't have state statute to do things and we don't have leadership willing to step up and say we have to do better, and that's where we should be allocating our money and our political and social capital, then what can we do with research, community organizing, data analysis to point to maps like that, to say like, now y'all can't say you don't know that specific neighborhoods that are disproportionately poor and black and brown folk are experiencing flooding and extreme heat. Now you're just saying you don't care, which I prefer that because it tells me the truth. Where we actually at, you don't give a damn. All right, so how do we move forward from there? that's my private citizen hat. So in a similar scenario, because I'm tired of seeing fare enforcement on a train that cost $1 billion plus, and folk clearly need it. Um, so we're like paying for people to enforce fare for people who can't afford fare, but it's public transportation, which drives me nuts. So it's like, all right, what can I do at work about that? Well, I can try to roll forward an idea for why we should do a study to look at what is the efficacy and a financial responsibility and a social responsibility in terms of charging fare. On my private life, I emailed my Met Council members. Your Met Council members are responsible to y'all, and I think a lot of folk aren't aware. Like, has the Met Council member for this district that y'all are in been here?
Looking up who that be.
Exactly, exactly. Right. So
Hello?
as I say, I know mine just because I looked it up because I was pissed off and frustrated.
I was just looking that up.
It might be. Is it
What
Engelbertson?
council district is this?
So like y'all have council members for the Met Council who are supposed to be responsible to y'all.
Is Marion Green one of them?
I have no idea. So what I did,
It used to be
Gary Cunningham, right? Yeah, they moved to DC.
DC, so it's a community.
Seems like it.
So who was he replaced and if so?
Oh yeah, they're replaced. Eric's trying to look that up.
I'm trying to.
So what I did,
Hello?
What do they do?
they're supposed to be responsive to the people who actually call them up, but no one knows that they're
Hello?
responsible to y'all.
Oh, but what do they do?
Hello?
So they sit on the various planning committees and commissions that make decisions about where we spend our money, which contractors we sign contracts with, what our policy should and shouldn't be. So should we have a sustainability mandate because it actually ties to economic competitiveness? If like a large portion of what's that? Eric is looking
trying
that
to
up
figure
right
that
now.
out.
So Eric's working on that. So what I do is I do coordinated emails across my county commissioner, my Met Council representative, my city council member, be like, y'all are all responsible to me and securing public health outcomes, and y'all ain't doing it. So I need a multi-jurisdictional meeting because that's y'all's job. And if you don't do that, on that other side too, I also reach out to folk I know in my organizing world who have that pressure to make sure they get that message, they get that email, they get that phone call, and I get that meeting. And then, demanding like, what are those pathways for it? A lot of the business hat is, the state legislature tells us what we have to do, and that's what it is. On the other hand, the council didn't originally plan to put stations on the Green Line in Frogtown, and Black and brown folk protested and said, how the hell are you going to spend all this money on a neighborhood and not give the stops? And then the council decided, I guess to do that. So the council is really good at responding to potentially bad PR, responsive to calling those who represent you. And like, y'all would be the largest group of people who's ever reached out to a Met Council member to say what you need.
Question, so you said multi-jurisdictional meeting, Met Council, County Commissioner,
And city.
and the city, so
Y'all-
city council?
Mhm.
Didn't know that.
And for me, jurisdiction, I
Hello?
loop in. All right, if, like y'all said, different ward with Jeremiah,
Hello?
right? But still systems impact,
Hello?
right? And who's north of North Minneapolis, Brooklyn Center, right? You got Northeast, that's Ward 1, that's Kevin Reich. Like, how many kids from North go to Edison High School? Right. So, like, we're talking about that impact as well. So, taking that bigger picture scopes, we're not just looking at where's heat occurring and localized flooding, but also who's responsible, supposedly responsive to us. Because y'all have built a really strong, incredible coalition. I think it's perfectly fair to demand this same among the representatives who we're all paying for with tax dollars.
And the other piece of this is, from our perspective, it's much better for us if we have a huge lead-in time. We don't want to do things on the back end. We don't want to have to try transit very late in the process. Good for us as an organization. So to be involved early would definitely, it gives us more lead time. We can better plan. I mean,
You don't have to be asked to the party. You're sitting back passively asking, like it's like a Sadie Hawkins dance. It be a problem. This has been intentional. Folks have been out of the game, hold on the window so that nobody can peer inside. That's why they're catching hell now, because the media have been coming to their meetings and they kicked out the media. The National Park Service has not been involved with this. It's insanity. The fact that transportation hasn't been built into this thing from the beginning is insanity. Have that kind of influx of traffic and not have Met Council involved in the discussion. It's
So Robert,
insane.
Robert Lilligren is the representative.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Echoing what a lot of folks have said from the transportation question, in 2013, the council did do a study of highway BRT and the I-94 corridor. I rated at a second, third for high potential for highway BRT, which we know transportation is our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, and with MnDOT doing this I-94 redesign 52, how did bus rapid transit get left off of the I-94 redesign of the Harbor Terminal project, where they easily have stopped at the amphitheater? What is the status of the Met Council negotiating with MnDOT in that interjurisdictional conversation to make sure that high bus rapid transit is brought to like I-94 during this? Freeways are only redesigned once every 20, 30 years, and as we know with climate change, we don't have that time to wait. So people, have been saying they're breathing in all these transportation-related emissions freeway. So I don't know if that's within your purview, but like, do you know if that council is actively advocating for highway bus rapid transit?
I have no idea. I used to be in that office, haven't been in it in
We'd
years.
have to circle back to you on.
Yeah.
We have to check with Metro Transit on that for that question.
Let me talk. The question was that.
I think the question was,
Away with
where's the Met Council at in terms of highway BRT for I-94? Is that correct? Yeah, for advocating for it.
It was studied in 2013 that there's high potential for highway BRT, and then it was left off a map of highway BRT.
We'd have to check with the staff down there and circle back, because I wouldn't want to give you, I wouldn't want to guess is what I'm saying. I wouldn't want to give you the wrong information.
Intern over there, the answer is like, it's real political, more than sensible.
You said that the responsibilities of that council were wastewater, something else. Current policy, so is that a venue then, or an avenue, I guess, that we could pursue in terms of engaging the Met Council to look at the affordable housing initiative as part of this project?
The way the affordable housing policy works is that, that requirement is in statute. So it's not a system, but it's in statute, so that we create a policy plan around affordable housing. But the difficulty with that is we don't really have very strong mechanisms around enforcement on that. So we can require communities to guide land for affordable housing, but beyond that, we can't actually require them to produce a certain number of units, for instance. Or not. We do track the land use guiding of cities to make sure that they are guiding sufficient land for the possibility of affordable housing. But that's pretty much as far as it goes, except for the communities that are involved or enrolled in the Livable Communities grant program. They have to actually show that they are producing affordable housing to be enrolled in the program.
That's the oversight. Where's the oversight?
We probably have to check with our housing colleagues on that.
Yeah,
I don't know if you.
I feel like the area we have the most oversight is when we're asked for money to help finance a project.
We can use that as a lever to.
Right, but if they're
You talk about livable community, but that's a venue for that. Has the city of Minneapolis this project or in the past, have they applied for a livable community grant?
For this site, no.
Not for this site, but they have
Lots of
they have
others.
applied for many different sites and been successful on many different occasions. So this isn't new territory for the city. You know, they would know how to apply, they would know the requirements and the deadlines, so they should be familiar with it.
One of many concerns I have is that this housing would be going up very close to GAF, the Shingle plant. And so is there anything that council would do to try and, I mean, it makes no sense clearly to make people sick, right? Put people in housing where they would be.
I
A
think that's a very good question. My sister lives quite close to that plant, and she's had health problems for the last decade. And
Man, this is your chance to help your sister.
well, I've been trying I was trying to get her to comment on some of, you know, when the PCA was looking at the GAF permit. And this is, again, with my Met Council hat off. I'm just telling you as a resident of Minneapolis. But I do think that the place where the Met Council could maybe comment on something like that would be at the environmental review stage, potentially, because this will most likely need to go through some sort of environmental review, whether it's a full-blown EIS, I'm not sure. It could be an AUAR, it could be an EAW, but it will need to go through some sort of environmental review, I would think.
Well, so they're saying it's in where, and
Okay.
I'd like to hear his transition. I mean, so is one of those going to get to the air pollution part of it?
You know how big the AUAR, the geographical area, because normally it's a pretty large area. Is it just the site? Do you know?
I have not, I've only gotten copies of these UARs from them,
Okay.
not the actual UAR. I've asked.
In terms of the air quality health component,
Can you find it?
I can look that up.
yeah, good. It sounds like PCA.
So when would an AUA, what triggers when an AUAR starts on a project like this? So are they even starting that? And what determines whether you go AUAR, EAW, which would then determine you go to EIS? Do we know that process?
I could get that information to you. My understanding of an AUAR is it essentially, it functions in place of an EAW. And an EAW is a process to go through to see if it needs to go through this very rigorous environmental review. So that you can think of an EAW as a sort of scoping or screening exercise to see if it needs, screening, not scoping. It's a screening exercise to see if it actually needs to go through a full-blown environmental review. An AUAR can replace EAW because it tends to encompass a larger area, and my understanding of it is that doesn't necessarily, it's a voluntary process, so there's not a threshold for that, but a city can choose to do that, and then once they've done it, then they don't have to think about thresholds in the future because they've done this voluntary process that tends to be a larger geographical area. Does that make sense?
There's
It's very,
going to be a project proposal that the AUAR is looking at, and they don't have a project proposal officially yet, right?
I just wanna know, are you all coming back? Are we gonna have more conversations like this? Because I gotta go.
I think they have to go too.
So, do you all plan on coming back to talk to the community? Are we gonna do this again? One shot, we're done? Okay.
I mean, I'm happy to. I got hella questions for y'all. Like, the first one I thought coming here was like, do y'all even want development there? Because like when I was in Northeast, it was like that would be a sweet park. Also, it drives me nuts. There's a power plant been across the river for.
That speaks to the original problem, that's the thing that's mess.
Mm.
There should have been, and there needs to be, a community plan for 48 acres. Not a city plan, not a developer plan, not a downtown plan, community generated plan. Because it could be transformative for the north side in terms of housing, in terms of small businesses, in terms of green space and fresh air, habitat restoration, improving the health of the river, improving the connection of the residents to the river. People are all about, we don't want polymet, we don't want Mayan-type boundary waters, but build whatever kind of crap you want on the river and bring thousands and thousands of people from elsewhere to our neighborhood. And we wouldn't have all these problems if we started with community plan.
So it seems that we need to have another meeting
Yeah.
like this, because it is 6:30. So what I'm asking is, are you all willing to come back?
It's 6:30.
Not too far out to continue this conversation.
Well,
To bring your answers back.
Yes, because you gotta check on quite a few things.
I've got a checklist.